Hello everyone and welcome to the Butterfly Princess Academy, where curiosity takes flight and wisdom wears wings. In today's lesson we're going to be looking at Anne Boleyn, who was the second wife of Henry VIII. This lesson is called Anne Boleyn, a revolutionary queen in Tudor England. Here goes. Introduction. Anne Boleyn, the second wife of Henry VIII, remains one of the most enigmatic and transformative figures in English history. Her brief but explosive reign from 1533 to 1536 catalysed the English Reformation, reshaped Tudor policies, and set the stage for the rise of Protestantism. This lesson examines Anne's life, influence and legacy through a multifaceted lens, weaving together political intrigue, religious upheaval and the precious agency of women in a practical world. Historical context. Tudor England, power, piety and priesthood. In the early 16th century, England was a realm defined by rigid hierarchies. The Catholic Church wielded immense spiritual and political power, while the nobility jostled for favour under the absolutist monarchy of the Tudors. Henry VIII's ascension in 1509 initially promised stability, but by the 1520s, his failure to produce a male heir with Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, a union sanctioned by papal suspension, threatening dynastic collapse. Henry VIII's quest for a son. Henry's obsession with securing a male successor became the driving force of his reign. Catherine of Aragon had six pregnancies, but yielded only one surviving child. Mary, who was female, deemed unfit to rule in a male-dominated society. By 1527, Henry sought an annulment, arguing their marriage violated Leviticus. In the book of Leviticus, verses 20 to verse 1, verses 20 to 21, that states, "If a man marries his brother's wife, they shall be childless." The Pope's refusal to annul the marriage, influenced by Catherine's nephew, Emperor Charles V, ignited Henry's defiance and set the stages for Anne Boleyn's rise. Anne's early life and background. The ambitious Boleyns. Anne, we don't know the exact date of Anne Boleyn's birth, but it was believed she could have been born around circa 1501 to Thomas Boleyn, a shrewd diplomat, and Elizabeth Howard, daughter of the Duke of Norfolk. Her family's ascent at court began with Thomas's role as ambassador to France and the Holy Roman Empire, and her sister Mary's notorious affair with Henry VIII. Unlike Mary, however, Anne refused to become a royal mistress, demanding marriage instead. A decision that reshaped her destiny. Education and continental influence. Anne spent her formative years at the court of Margaret of Austria and Queen Claude of France, where she absorbed Renaissance humanism, French elegance, and evangelical ideas. Fluent in French and well-read in theology, she returned to England in 1522 with a sophistication that distinguished her from other courtiers. Her wit, charm, and love rituals captured Henry, who began pursuing her in 1526. Rise to power, courtship, and the great matter. Henry's pursuit of Anne spanned 7 years, 1526 to 1533, marked by passionate letters. A quote from one letter is, "My heart and I surrender ourselves into your hands," an escalating conflict with Rome. And leveraging her influence, encouraged Henry to embrace radical solutions. The king, advised by reformist thinkers like Thomas Cranmer and Thomas Cromwell, severed ties with the Catholic Church, declaring himself supreme head of the Church of England by the Act of Supremacy of 1534. Catalyst of the English Reformation. Anne's role in the Reformation was both ideological and pragmatic. She introduced Henry to William Tyndale's The Obedience of a Christian Man, which argued monarchs and popes, not popes, held divine authority. Her allies included Cranmer and New Latimer, spearheaded doctrinal reforms, while the dissolution of monasteries redistributed wealth to the crown. Throughout, though unopposed for monasteries' destruction, her advocacy for secular Bibles and anti-clerical rhetorical rhetoric aligned with broader reformist goals. Queenship and reforms, a Renaissance court. As queen, Anne transformed court culture. She prioritised artists patronised artists like Hans Holbein, promoted French fashions and hosted salons where humorists debated theology. Her motto, that translates into English as "the time will come," hinted at her vision for a reformed England. She also championed women's education, funding scholarship and commissioning translations of religious texts. Religious radicalism. Anne's advocacy extended beyond aesthetics. She smuggled Protestant literature into England, protecting reformers from persecution, and influenced episcopal appointments, notably Cranmer's elevation to Archbishop of Canterbury. Her belief in justification by faith and disdain for Catholic idolatry positioned her as a protagist figure, though her theology remained ambiguous. Downfall and execution, miscarriage and political isolation. Anne's downfall began in 1536 when she miscarried a male fetus at 15 weeks. The loss, coupled with Henry's infatuation with Jane Seymour, eroded her position. Thomas Cromwell, once her ally, orchestrated her demise to consolidate his power and religion and regain England with conservative factions, fabricated charges and show trial. In April 1536, Anne was arrested on charges of adultery with 5 men, including her brother George, incest and treason. The trials, devoid of credible evidence, relied on confessions and court gossip. Historians like Eric Ives argues that the charges were politically motivated, designed to eliminate Anne and her faction. Execution and aftermath. On the 19th of May 1936, Anne was beheaded by a French swordsman, a final act of mercy from Henry. Her dignified final speech, "I pray God save the King for a gentler nor a more merciful prince was there ever," underscored her political acumen. Henry married Jane Seymour 11 days later, signalling Anne's erasure from court memory. Legacy and historical debate. Mother of Elizabeth I. Anne's greatest legacy was her daughter Elizabeth I, whose 45-year reign defined England's golden age. Elizabeth's Protestant policies, intellectual curiosity, and mastery of statecraft reflected Anne's influence, though she rarely spoke of her mother publicly. From Lutheran hearth to feminist icon. Traditionally, historiography shaped by Catholic policymakers like Nicholas Sander painted Anne as a manipulative seductress. Modern scholars, however, emphasise her agency. Feminist historians such as Susanna Lipscomb reinterprets her as a Protestant, a proto-reformer navigating political constraints. Cultural immortality. Anne's life has inspired countless works, from Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall, which was published in 2003 and was a series which critiques her ambition to be Other Boleyn Girl by Philippa Gregory, which was published in 2001, which sensationalizes her rivalry with Mary. Portrayals range from tragic heroine, for example, the way she is portrayed by the actress Natalie Garmer in the TV series The Tudors, to political operator when she was portrayed by the actress Claire Foy in the Wolf Hall series. Primary sources. Key documents: Henry's love letters, Eustace Shaftesbury's dispatches hostile to Anne, and trial records reveal biases. For example, Shaftesbury's ambassador to Charles V labelled Anne the concubine, while Cromwell's letters depict her as a threat. The absence of Anne's own writings, only two often letters by Anne survive, complicates efforts to reconstruct her voice. The guilt debate. Most historians agree that the charges against Anne were fabricated. David Starkey notes the improbability of her committing adultery while under constant surveillance. Yet J.W. Barnard controversially argues she may have flirted with courtiers, giving Cromwell plausible pretext. Broader impact. Protestant identity and nationalism. Anne's marriage to Henry accelerated England's break from Rome, paving the way for Edward VI's reforms. Edward VI was Henry VIII's son, long awaited for son with Jane Seymour reforms, and Elizabeth's via media. By the 17th century, Protestantism became central to English identity, a legacy rooted in Anne's defiance, gender peril and peril. Anne's story amplifies the double bind of influential women in She wielded unprecedented power for a queen consort, but faced vilification for transcending traditional roles. Her execution underscores the fragility of women authority in the Tudor court. Conclusion. Anne Boleyn's life was a paradox of triumph and tragedy. She ignited a religious revolution, redefined queenship, and shaped England's future. Yet her legacy was nearly erased by the misogynistic narratives of her era. Today she endures as a symbol of resilience, a woman who dared to challenge the limits of her world. As historian Gimmon McCormick observes, without Anne there would have been no Elizabeth, no Anglican Church, no British Empire. Her story is not merely one of personal ambition, but of the schematic shifts that occur when power, faith, and identity collide. So here's the analysis about Anne Boleyn. So the lesson is organised chronologically and thematically, balancing narrative storytelling with critical analysis. Its structure reflects the complexity of Anne Boleyn's life and legacy. Agency versus victimhood. The lesson emphasises Anne's political axiom, for example, her role in the Reformation, while acknowledging constraints that led to her downfall. Religious reform. It positions Anne as a catalyst for England's break with Rome, linking her ever-learning to Henry VIII's legislative actions. Gender dynamics. The lesson critiques Tudor misogyny, highlighting how Anne's ambition clashed with social expectations of female subversions. Quote inscription. Without Anne there would have been no Elizabeth, no Anglican Church, no British Empire. And that's from the historic conclusion, underscores her transformative impact. The lesson engages with conflicting interpretation of Anne, reflecting shifts in historical scholarship. Traditional views, 16th and the 19th centuries. Catholic popularist chronicles like Nicholas Sanger, 1585, depicted Anne as a Lutheran whore and a schemer who manipulated Henry. Victorian moralists, 19th century historians like James Anthony Frog framed her as a tragic but morally flawed character. Quote, she was a woman of great ambition and virtue. Feminist scholarship. Eric Ives' The Life and Death of Anne Boleyn, published in 2004, portrays her as a politically astute reformer. Cultural historian Susanna Whitcomb highlights Anne's intellectual combinations, arguing she was a woman ahead of her time. A quote. Anne was a key player in the Reformation, not just its catalyst. G.W. Barnard, Anne Boleyn Fatal Attraction, published in 2010, controversially suggests Anne may have been guilty of adultery, citing her flirtatious court behaviour. Quote, her downfall was not inevitable, but neither was it wholly undeserved. The essay navigates bias in key documents. Henry VIII's love letters, tone passionate. My heart and I surrender ourselves into your hands, but politically strategic. Limitations. Henry's letter revealed obsessions, not Anne's agency. Eustace Shaftesbury's dispatches, biases. Chapuis, an ambassador to Catherine of Aragon's nephew, called out the concubine and blamed her for Catherine's mistreatment. Value provides insight into conservative opposition to Anne, trial records, flaws, concurrent confessions, and lack of due process. For example, George Boleyn's trial lasted only 15 minutes. Quote, the evidence against her was fabricated, but the court's verdict was never in doubt. That's a quote from historian David Starker. The lesson effectively situates Anne within broader Tudor crisis, the English Reformation, Act of Supremacy 1534. The lesson links Anne's influence to Henry's defiance of Rome through debates persist about her theological role. Dissolution of monasteries. While Anne opposed the destruction of Catholic institutions, her allies, including like Thomas Cromwell, used it to fuel royal reforms. Quote, Anne's court became a hub for reformers, but her own favour remains enigmatic. That was a quote from historian E.W. Ives. Boleyn versus Seymour factions. The lesson highlights Thomas Cromwell's betrayal, driven by his alliance with conservative nobles, gender and power. The lesson critiques gender and power roles through Anne's experience. Queenship. Anne's patronage of female education and French fashions challenged traditional gender roles. Execution. Her trial exposed the fragility of female influence. Henry's swift marriage to Jane Seymour underscored her replaceability. A woman's power is always contingent on male approval. Anne learned this too late, and that quote is from historian Helen Castor on Tudor gender dynamics. The lesson examines Anne's mythologized in popular culture. Literature. Wolf Hall, published in 2003 by the author Hilary Mantel, frames her as a Machiavellian figure. The other Belingo by the author Philippa Gregory, which was published in 2001, sensationalizes her sibling rivalry with her sister Mary. Film TV adaptation. Natalie Dormer's portrayal in The Tudors 2007 to 2008 humanizes her, while Claire Foy in Wolf Hall Claire Foy's portrayal of Anne Boleyn in Wolf Hall in the 2015 TV adaptation of Wolf Hall emphasises her political ruthlessness. Another quote from author Joanna Denny on her enduring cultural appeal. Anne Boleyn is a mirror we see in her what we want to see. Conclusions. I'm not going to go into that. Anne Boleyn, from final quote for this section. Anne Boleyn's story is not just about one woman, it's about how history is written, contested and reimagined. And that is a quote from historian Alison Weir on her enduring relevance. So, some questions now. To what extent? So I'm going to read you the questions and then I'm going to read you the answer. To what extent was Anne Boleyn responsible for the English Reformation, and how does this contrast with traditional narratives that credit Henry VIII or Thomas Cromwell? Anne was the Reformation figurehead, but Cromwell's its engineer. That was quote from J.W. Barnard. Next one. How reliable are Eustace Shaftesbury's dispatches as historical evidence, given his open hostility to Anne and allegiance to Catherine of Aragon? How did Anne Boleyn navigate peculiar Tudor structures to wield influence, and what does her downfall reveal about the limits of female agency in the 16th century? Why do historians like Eric Ives argues that Anne's trial was murder, while J.W. Barnard suggests she may have engaged in risky courtly behaviour? Was Anne a committed Protestant reformer, or did she opportunistically use religious rhetoric to secure power? How did Anne's upbringing in European courts shape her understanding of power and diplomacy in Henry VIII's England? What role did the Boleyn Howard factions play in Anne's rise, and how did Thomas Cromwell's alliance with conservative nobles lead to her downfall? How might Anne's 1536 miscarriage have altered Henry VIII's perception of her, and was Jane Seymour's rise inevitable? Did Anne Boleyn's queenship differ from Catherine of Aragon in terms of religious influence and courtly patronage? How did Anne's French connections and advocacy for alliances with Protestant states influence England's diplomatic stance? Why does Anne Boleyn remain a pop culture icon, and how did portrayals in works like The Other Boleyn Girl distort or illuminate her historical legacy? What traits did Elizabeth I inherit from Anne, and how did her mother's execution shape Elizabeth's approach to power? What do Henry VIII's passionate letters to Anne reveal about their relationship, authenticity versus political calculation? Why did Henry VIII choose a French swordsman for beheading, and how did this reflect her contradictory feelings towards her? Why was Anne buried in an unmarked grave at the Tower of London, and how does this reflect her revision from Tudor history? Were Anne's trial and execution justified by Tudor legal standards, or were they purely politically motivated? How did Anne's alleged adultery compare to Henry VIII's well-documented infidelities, and why was she punished more harshly? Did Anne's advocacy for reform align with her personal beliefs, or was she complicit in Henry's exploitation of religion for dynastic goals? Alternative history. Now, this is a really interesting one for me, because I'm really interested in Anne Boleyn and all that. So listen to this. Alternate history. If Anne had born a son in 1533 or 1536, how might Tudor history and the Reformation have unfolded differently? How does Anne Boleyn's story resonate with contemporary discussions about women in power, media scrutiny and cancel culture. Quotes for discussions. Anne's final word. I pray God save the king, for a gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never. Was this genuine loyalty a final act of defiance or a plea to protect Elizabeth's future? Henry VIII's grief, she who has been the Queen of England on earth will stay become a Queen in heaven Almighty, spoken after the execution. Does this suggest remorse, or was it a political theatre? Feminist reclamation. Anne Boleyn was not a victim. She was a strategist in a man's world. That's a quote from historian Susanna Lipscomb. So I will read you the answers now. So question 1. Anne Boleyn was the catalyst for the Reformation, introducing Henry to reformist ideas, for example, William Tyndale's work and advocating for veterinary Bibles. However, Thomas Cromwell engineered the political and legislative break with Rome. As noted by J.W. Barnard, Anne was the Reformation's figurehead, but Cromwell its engineer. Traditional narratives overstate Henry's theological motivations. His primary goal was securing an annulment. Question 2 answer. Shaftesbury's Catherine of Aragon's partisan depicted Anne as a concubine and schemer. His hostility skews his accounts, but they reveal conservative opposition to Anne and the Boleyn faction. Historians use his dispatches cautiously, cross-referencing with other sources like Henry's letters. Question 3 answer. Anne navigated through a man's world through intellect, education, and patronage, for example, promoting female scholars. Her downfall underscores the power of female influence in a male-dominated court. As historian Susanna Lipscomb argues, she was a strategist in a man's world, yet her execution proved even queens were expandable. Question 4 answer. Eric Ives schemes Anne's trial a juridical murder, citing fabricated evidence and cornered confessions. G.W. Barnard persists her flirtations gave Cromwell pretext. Both agree politics, not justice, drove her fall. Question 5 answer. Anne supported reformist clergy, for example, Thomas Cranmer, and distributed banned texts suggesting genuine Protestant learnings. However, her alliance with Henry's annulment quest also served personal ambition. Her faith blended idealism with pragmatism. Question 6. At Margaret of Austria and Queen Claude's courts, Anne observed Renaissance humanism and French diplomacy. This shaped her cultural reforms, for example, courtly etiquette and diplomatic advocacy for Franco-English alliances. Question 7. The Boleyn-Howard faction secured Anne's queenship, but Thomas Cromwell aligned with conservatives, for example, the Seymour family, to eliminate rivals. Anne's miscarriage in 1536 weakened her position, enabling Cromwell's plot. Question 8 answer. The miscarriage of the male heir shattered Henry's hopes, fueling his pursuit of Jane Seymour. Seymour's rise was not inevitable, but capitalised on Anne's vulnerability and Cromwell's influence. Question 9. Catherine upheld Catholic traditions, while Anne championed reformist clergy and French-inspired court culture. Anne's queenship marked a shift towards Protestant learning patronage. Question 10. Anne's French ties encouraged alliances against Habsburg powers, though Henry's vindicating diplomacy limited her impact. Her advocacy for reformist states foreshadowed Elizabeth I's Protestant foreign policy. Question 11 answer. Anne's dramatic life romance, betrayal, execution resonates in the media. The other Boleyn girls sensualised her as a seductress, distorting her intellectual and political roles. Elizabeth inherited Anne's wit, education, and religious pragmatism. Anne's execution taught Elizabeth caution, shaping her celibacy in statecraft. 13. Henry's letters, "My heart and I surrender ourselves into your hands," reveal infatuation, but also strategic courtship to secure an annulment. The French swordsman symbolised Harry's residual affection, sparing her the brutality of an axe. Yet his swift remarriage to Jane Seymour underscores the replaceability. Buried anonymously in the Tower Chapel, Anne's erasure reflected Henry's vindictiveness. Today, her grave mark in 1876 symbolises her reclaimed legacy. Question 16 answer. The trial violated Tudor legal norms. No defence counsel, heresy evidence. Anne was a scapegoat for factional policies and Henry's dynastic desperation. Henry's affair with including Mary Boleyn, Anne's sister, and Bessie Blount, who he fathered a male heir with, and he was the only bastard child that he acknowledged. They actually named him Henry Fitzroy. Fitzroy was a royal name. Was tolerated. Anne's alleged adultery warranted execution. Tudor misogyny punished female sexuality harshly. Anne's reformist advocacy aligned with personal faith, but she enabled Henry's supremacy over the church. Her role in dissolving many monasteries remains debated. So, alternate history, a son for Anne. A surviving son might have stabilised the Tudor line, delaying Elizabeth's reign. The Reformation could have been slower, balancing reform and tradition. Anne's stories mirrors modern scrutiny of women in power, media vilification, gender double standards. For example, Hillary Clinton and Meghan Markle. Anne's final words. Conclusion. Anne Boleyn's legacy intertwines ambition, reform, and her life illuminates Tudor power dynamics, gender constraints, and the birth of English Protestantism, a figure endlessly reinterpreted across history and culture. Right, done that. So here are some rhetorical questions designed to promote deep reflection on Anne Boleyn's life. So I'll read you the questions and then I'll read you the insights. So if Anne Boleyn had been born a man, would her ambition have been celebrated rather than condemned? Reflect on gender preconceptions of power and ambition into the society. Can we truly separate Anne's rise from her fall, or were both outcomes bound by the same constraints? Was Anne's execution a failure of her strategy or a testament to the impossibility of winning a game rigged against women? Did Anne Boleyn champion the Reformation out of faith, survival, or ambition? Or does such a distinction ever matter? If Henry VIII had secured a male heir with Anne, would history remember her as a reformer or a footnote? Can Anne's trial be called unjust in a system where the law served the king's will, not truth? When history condemns Anne for adultery, why do we overlook Henry's documented infidelities as kingly prototypes? Does Anne Boleyn's cultural fame as a seductress obscure her intellectual contributions to the Renaissance court? How much of Anne's story remains untold because history is written by the victors and she was not one? If Anne had lived to see Elizabeth's reign, would she have been proud of her daughter's compromises or horrified by them? What does Anne's erasure from Tudor monuments, for example, unmarked grave, say about fear of women who defy silence? Can we reclaim Anne Boleyn as a proto-feminist icon, or does that impose modern ideals on a pre-feminist world? When we call Anne a survivor, do we risk romanticising her trauma to fit empowering narratives? Why does Anne Boleyn fascinate us more than Henry's other wives? Is it her defiance, her intellect, or her tragedy? If Anne's ghost could speak, would she warn future women about power or urge them to seize it anyway? So here are some insights. 1. In Tudor England, male ambition was synonymous with leadership, while female ambition was often labelled as manipulative or dangerous. Male courtiers like Thomas Cromwell wielded power without the gendered scrutiny Anne faced. Her downfall reflects social discomfort with women who transcended prescribed roles. Historian Gareth Russell notes, a man in her position might have been a statesman, a woman was deemed a schemer. Next insight into the next questions. Anne's ascent relied on leveraging her intellect and charm within a practical framework, but the same system ensured her vulnerability. Her fall was not a failure of strategy, but a consequence of existing in a structure where female power was inherently perilous. As Helen Casker argues, the game was rigged. The higher she climbed, the harder the backlash. Next insights. Anne's support for reform is likely a blend of genuine belief and political pragmatism. She distributed banned Protestant works and patronised reformers like William Tyndale, yet her advocacy also secured her position. Historian Eric Ives suggests her faith was sincere, but it was inseparable from her survival in a cutthroat court. Next insights. A male heir might have solidified her legacy as a queen rather than a tragic figure. However, her role in the Reformation was pivotal regardless. Her influence on Henry's break with Rome reshaped England's religious treachery. Without her, the Reformation might have unfolded more slowly, as noted by historians. Next insight. Tudor justice was a tool of royal authority. Anne's trial, with its lack of evidence and corner confessions, amplifies how law was weaponised for political ends. David Starkey called it a judicial murder cloaked in legal protagamy. Next insight. Tudor society normalised male promiscuity as kingly workings, while punishing female sexuality harshly. Anne's alleged adultery was a pretext to eliminate her, reflecting misogynistic double standards. As Susanna Lipscomb states, her guilt was less about sin and more about silencing a woman who dared to rise. Next insight. Pop culture often reduces Anne to a romantic figure, overshadowing her patronage of Renaissance humorism and reform. Her court was a hub for thinkers like Nicholas Bourbon, yet films like The Other Boleyn Girl emphasised scandal over scholarship. Next insight. Anne's enemies, Henry Cromwell, Shaftesbury, shaped her narrative. Primary sources like Shaftesbury's dispatches are steeped in bias, requiring historians to read against the grain of advises to reconstruct her agency. Next insight. While feminism is a modern concept, Anne's defiance of gender norms advocates for education, challenging male authority resonates with feminist ideas. Joanna Geary cautions, we must cautelise her actions within Tudor constraints, not ours. Next insight. Portraying Anne as a survivor risks glossing over her trauma, for example, her miscarriage and execution. A balanced view acknowledges both her resilience and victimhood. As Hilary Mantel explores in Wolf Hall, she was neither saint nor sinner, but a weapon, a woman navigating impossible choices. Her blend of intellect, defiance, and tragedy captivates modern audiences. Unlike Catherine of Aristocracy or Jane Seymour's passivity, Anne's story embraces drama and agency. As Alison Weir observes, she is the Tudor enigma, a woman who dared loss and still won immortality. Insight. Metamorphically, she might warn of traps, but also urge women to seize agency. Her legacy is a paradox, a cautionary tale, and a rallying cry, embodying both the parallels and necessity of ambition. Conclusion. Anne Boleyn's life forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, gender, and historical memory. Her story is not just Tudor history, it's a lens to examine how societies vilify ambitious women, distort narratives, and yet cannot fully erase their impact. As historian Lucy Worsley summarises, Anne teaches us that history is never just about the past, it's about who gets to tell the story. In the end, Anne's greatest triumph may be her enduring presence in our collective imagination. A woman who dared to rise, fell violently, and yet still refuses to be forgotten. Her life layered with paradox remains a testament to the complexity of human ambition and the enduring quest for agency in an unequal world. Remember me when you do pray, that hope doth lead from day to day. That is a quote from Anne Boleyn herself that was inscribed in her Book of Hours. This closing line attributed to Anne serves as both a plea and a provocation to remember her not as a cautionary tale, but as a figure who defined the limits of her world, and in doing so reshaped history. And that, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, concludes today's lesson at the Butterfly Princess Academy, where curiosity takes flight and wisdom wears wings. I would very much like now to finish off by thanking everyone who has joined me today for this lesson at the Academy, and very much hope you can join me again in the very near future for future lessons. But don't forget, our lessons at the Academy are uploaded onto the Butterfly Princess Academy Facebook page and YouTube channel, so you can watch them whenever you get a free moment. So thanks again, take care, and I will see you very soon. Bye bye for now.